Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and get started. So as people come in, there may be some additional folks, but just make sure that we are getting started on time for the folks who are online now. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're able to take time out of your day to join us for this webinar that we hope will be really not only timely and informative, but hopefully inspiring as well in the work that you do every day. We definitely wanted to be responsive to this current moment, and that's why we're really happy to be working with Monisha Kaplan, who is the founder and CEO of ProInspire, and she will be really leading us on this webinar about the leadership practices for inclusion and impact in this COVID-19 moment, and we'll get deep into those conversations in the next hour. But just really want to appreciate everyone who's able to join us, and so excited to have Monisha with us today. And we also have from the Women's Funding Network, Tajma as well, who's going to be guiding us through the webinar as well. Again, just really happy that everyone's here and looking forward to the presentation today. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Elizabeth. Thank you to you too for joining us and welcoming everybody. Again, my name is Tajma Beverly. I'm the Deborah Holmes Fellow with the Women's Funding Network, and I'm here to support this webinar presentation. I just want to do a little housekeeping that we are going to get to some of your questions. Please use the chat function to chat your questions. You can go ahead and chat them out to everybody, and I will be culling through those and then calling Monisha to respond to them. So you're welcome to do that. Now I'm delighted to turn the presentation over to Monisha Kaplan to tell us more about racial equity in this COVID-19 moment. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Tajma and Elizabeth. It's really nice to be with you all, even though I know we're all facing unprecedented change. When I first discussed with the Women's Funding Network doing this as a webinar, it was a follow-up from the conference in September, and ProInspire has been working on a set of leadership practices for inclusion and impact to support organizations that are advancing racial equity. And as we are really facing this moment, really thinking about how these leadership practices are even more relevant. To tell you a little bit more about myself, and then we'll dive in. I'm Monisha Kaplan. I am the founder and CEO of ProInspire. ProInspire is a nonprofit. We are 11 years old and focus on supporting leaders at all levels to accelerate equity. We work with the social sector, focusing on individuals through training, coaching, supporting organizations through capacity building, whether it's partnering directly with nonprofits or doing cohorts for foundations, and at the systems level, where we're thinking a lot about how do we influence the sector to advance leadership and equity. And the work that I'll be sharing today around leadership practices really connects to all these things. It's something that we're planning to publish in June, but also use to support individuals through trainings, as well as organizations that are looking at how they can support their leaders to better accelerate inclusion, equity, and impact. So to get us started, would love to hear who's on the line. And so if you can use the chat box, share your name, the organization, where you're based. I know that there are members from all over the world. And what are you doing to take care of yourself in this time of unprecedented change? So really just want to invite people to chat in the chat box to see who's here. And I'll share for myself, again, Monisha from ProInspire. I am based in the Washington, D.C. area. And one of the things I'm doing to take care of myself in this moment is really trying to make time to be outside. I'm finding when I'm out in nature that it's helping me to sort of ease all the worries that when I'm looking at my phone or at the news are really stressing me out. See, and Taj, are you able to see people chatting in?
I don't. Let's see.
All right, well, we'll keep going, but hopefully you can use the chat box as a way to make sure that we're hearing from all the different folks who are on the line. So what we'll talk about today is first, why we need to reimagine leadership. Then I'll share more about ProInspire's leadership practices for inclusion and impact. And we're going to focus on 4 practices that are really critical in this COVID moment, and then have time for Q&A. So why do we need to reimagine leadership? First of all, even before the COVID-19 crisis, we've been thinking a lot about how there's organizations, the work that they do is changing, who works in the social sector and nonprofits and foundations is changing, and that we're really shifting models to address inequities. And that's so important for us to be doing. And now all of these are being underlined by the crisis, which is really of epic proportions in how it's impacting individuals and organizations and amplifying inequities. So first, what's changing? What organizations do? Really, over the last decade, there's been a greater focus on systems change. And for those of you who are working in the sector or are donors have seen that we're moving away from funding only immediate needs, but also thinking about what are the underlying systems and how do we change the way those work, recognizing that those systems are rooted in oppression, and that if we actually want to change the future, we have to look at those systems. We're also seeing organizations are moving from charity to justice mindsets. I often say that really the 60s were about charities, and those who were kind of coming to work in the social sector were thinking about charities. And then the 90s were about change. And the current work is really about justice and how do we actually undo a lot of the things that were built into our systems. And who works in organizations? We have much more diverse workforces across multiple elements of identities and a much stronger awareness of the racial leadership gap. So I'm sure this is something that you all have talked about in the past webinars, but really the nonprofit sector is not representative of the working population, and in particular is not representative of the communities that are being impacted by nonprofits. If you look at the data from Board Source and Building Movement Project and Pew, there's a huge racial leadership gap. And shifting models that the way funding is happening, philanthropy changing, technology, also kind of different ways of working, recognizing that movements are so critical to changing the systems, as well as collaborations, that organizations can't continue to work in silos if we're trying to change the systems. And that we need to focus on racial equity to advance impact, that if we don't actually address the things that were built into the system, we won't be able to change how they look. And we see this as important around addressing the interconnected systems of oppression. So communities are impacted by so many systems: housing, economic security, health, education, and they're also interconnected. And this is particularly amplified in this COVID moment, where we're seeing people who are being impacted, if they're facing insecurity in any one of these places, are really being critically impacted. So what are we facing? We're facing a crisis that's impacting every social sector system. Many nonprofits are in crisis mode, and we see this crisis happening both from a financial perspective, that or many organizations don't have financial security to be able to navigate the loss of income that may be coming from lack of funding, lack of being able to deliver the services that they have and so forth, because of the requirement that they aren't with people. The other aspect of the crisis mode that nonprofits are facing is just that their staff, how people are grappling with this, whether it's anxiety, whether it's child care responsibilities, elder care responsibilities, health responsibilities. So just nonprofits aren't able to continue doing the important work they already had. Inequities are really amplified by the COVID-19 crisis. This is the kind of moment where the idea of paid sick leave is something that people are really saying, like, how have we not had this? And recognizing who has access to work from home or access to healthcare, and the fact that the real lack of social safety net that nonprofits have been talking about for decades is becoming a much more spotlight on that. The other pieces that are really important in this is that people of color are overrepresented in the groups that are most at risk. So those who are most in the front line, whether that's people who interact with individuals through in day-to-day jobs that they have, in whether it's the healthcare system, care workers, restaurant workers, and so really what they're facing, as well as the lack of leadership at the federal level is exacerbating the crisis. So I've talked to a lot of CEOs who are realizing that they really are the most trusted person for many organizations, because there isn't clear information coming from typical places that people would turn to. So what does this mean for leadership? Really, that we have to reimagine leadership. The way that things have been in the past is not how we can do them in the future. And when we think about the leadership practices, we think some key elements are bringing a racial equity lens into expectations for leaders. So the idea that racial equity is only something that some leaders need is not true, that every leader needs to be thinking about racial equity and how they approach their work. And part of that is valuing lived experience and ways of being, really thinking about leaders' roles not as kind of top down around how things need to be done, but recognizing that lived experience is so critical to how people are able to contribute to the organization. Shared decision making with those most impacted. And this is really different from a lot of traditional models of leadership, which are much more top-down decision making, but recognizing that if we're going to advance equity, our leadership practices have to be more focused on shared decision making and focusing on equitable distribution of resources. So realizing that equal is not equitable, and I'm sure many people have seen some of the graphics that talk about that, but what are leaders' jobs in thinking about that? So that may be thinking about the services organizations provide, whether more resources need to go to certain programs to really support equitable distribution of resources. So I want to share the leadership practices for inclusion and impact. This is something that ProInspire has been working on for about 4 years now, and we're in the final stage. We're planning to publish this research in June. But really at the core of this is a set of principles that we believe are critical for leaders at all levels in the sector to really advance impact. So first, leaders must center equity in their work. Second is that anyone can be a leader from any position, really trying to take away this idea that we often say informally at ProInspire, there's leadership, big L and little l, that everyone is a leader. And so much of our image in society has been leader is the person who has the most decision-making power, or in hierarchical organizations sits on the team reporting to the CEO, but actually anyone can be a leader from any position within an organization or a system. You don't even have to be in a system to be a leader. And that individuals inside organizations and systems can be the ones to change them. So a big part of what we think about is how leaders need to be able to change the way things are, because we know that the systems we're in aren't operating the way that they should be. And we think about racial equity underlying all elements of leadership. So as it relates to knowledge, leaders having the ability to center racism, systemic oppression, and inequities across their work. So really deepening their knowledge to be able to do that as they think about anything from the programming to the resourcing to the operations of their work. As well as recognizing power and privilege and dominant culture, and how important it is to have that knowledge and also the ability to talk about those things. So for example, in my organization, we've been talking about power and privilege as it relates to being able to work from home, or people who have childbearing responsibilities, or homeschooling responsibilities right now. And if those people are in positions of authority, what is that power and privilege they have? And how does that impact the rest of the team? The mindsets around valuing lived experience and ways of being. Another key mindset is really expecting engagement of community. And I think in this COVID moment, this is even more important because our traditional ways of engaging with community, unless they were digital, are no longer accessible. And so how do we actually engage community to be really sharing in these decisions, bringing their voice into the questions that organizations are facing, and modeling responsibility to speak about race. And so I think I saw this recently with some of the Congress people who are highlighting that any resourcing for COVID really needs to bring a racial equity approach to it. Tracking, for example, where testing is done, and racial demographics. Finally, skills that underlie all elements of leadership are disaggregating data. So being able to understand race disparities, being able to analyze contributions to structural racism. So knowing that racism is built into our structures, and how do our organization or our work, how are they contributing potentially to some of those because of the systems that we operate within, and identifying how bias shows up and influences actions. So those are some of the pieces that underlie what we think are really 16 key practices for inclusion and impact. And we think about those along kind of 4 key aspects of leadership: leading self, leading people, leading organizations, and leading systems. So that relates to leading self, really active learning, and the role that we all have to continuously be learning. And specifically as it relates to inclusion and racial equity, to be learning and building those skills and continuously pushing ourselves around that. Emotional agility, being able to adapt, as well as recognize your own emotions, recognize the emotions of others, and adapt to how to navigate those. Intentionally adapting, I think this moment really is calling all of us for intentional adaptation, being able to really grapple with, as there's uncertainty, how do individuals navigate themselves to adapt to those, and having a sense of identity. We think that this is a core part of leading yourself, is really knowing your elements of your identity, having spent time to think about that and how that impacts the way you approach things. Around leading people, conscious communication, building relationships, fostering inclusive environment, and lifting voices. And we're going to talk more about each of these because we think these are particularly important for organizations in this COVID-19 moment. For leading organizations, dynamic problem solving. So really being able to think through different problems and how to approach those. Collaborative decision making, as I mentioned before, really looking at shared decision making and how do you bring people with different perspectives together around those pieces. Developing a shared vision. It's so critical for leaders to be able to do that, a vision is not just set by the person or people at the top, but really is a shared vision, not just within an organization, but oftentimes across organizations or across networks to really advance change. And navigating multiple perspectives. A key element we think around this for leaders is how to navigate that. And finally, the systems piece that is so critical for leaders at all levels. First is systems thinking and recognizing how systems are connected. The second piece is having an innovative approach to, like, how do we actually change the systems and being able to question the existing ways. Another piece is really aligning values as we look at the systems and see where they may or may not be working with our values. How do we shift the systems to align with our values? And finally, reimagining the sector. We've been using sort of reimagine leadership, but we think part of it is actually how do we reimagine the way we work? And you'll see across all of these leadership practices, we think about leadership at, and leadership at is really the levels at which oppression shows up. So at the individual level, at the interpersonal level, at the institutional level, and at the ideological level, which is really beliefs and norms. And we think about each of these practices, not just for self, people, organizations, and systems, but as you're thinking about how oppression can show up, how can you use these practices to really address that? So for example, at the interpersonal level, really emotional agility, the importance of building relationships, and as it relates to race equity, we think that's such a core part of having a culture focus on race equity is those relationships. Collaborative decision-making and innovative approaches are all pieces that really help to address oppression that can show up at the interpersonal level. And so we can see each of these practices connecting both to leading of and leading at. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what are some practices that are really critical in this moment. And we have been talking a lot in our organization about leading people because every nonprofit is grappling with what does this mean for the work they're doing for their staff, for their volunteers, for the community they work with. And the 4 practices, conscious communication, building relationships, fostering inclusive climate, and lifting voices, are important all the time, but in particular right now are things that we want leaders to be focusing on. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these, and I want you to be sharing what are some of the practices you're doing around this. So if you can pop that into the chat box as we are going through, this is a space to also do some knowledge sharing. And so,
Monisha,
oh
I
yes,
just want to chime in here. We're having a little issue with the chat function. So what I'd like to do is take a moment and unmute everybody. And if we can maybe take questions that way, just
okay.
have people pose their questions to you through audio, I think that would be great.
Yes, that's not a problem. So if Tajma is going to unmute everyone, so if you want to mute yourself and then you can unmute, and I'll share a little bit, and then I'll ask people to ask questions or share around each of these. So I'll start with conscious communication. So really, some of the pieces that are part of this is one, focusing on the other person that you're communicating with or the groups that you're communicating with. So much of how we traditionally think about communication is, how am I a good communicator? What are the ways that I can communicate better? But actually, conscious communication is very much focused on the other people and having reflection and discovery. So really, that might involve inquiry to understand what are the ways that people want to communicate or how they can best be engaged in communication. It also means building honesty, vulnerability, and trust through communication. And this is even more important right now, as well as the knowledge and flexibility to communicate across diverse social identities and lived experiences. And I think this is why, even talking about lived experience is so important for us to be doing in organizations, because if we can be conscious about highlighting our own lived experiences, talking about our identity or privilege, then that will create space for others to share that and also enable us to have much more conscious communication. So some of the things that are important in this moment, one is just communicating as much as possible. And you'll see this in some of the best practices for crisis, really is communication. And so we're seeing organizations, some of them do a daily check-in call for their full staff, or looking at different ways of communicating, which is another piece. Recognizing that people have lots of things that are impacting them right now. So they may not be able to be on a daily check-in call. So thinking about conscious communication in this moment might mean that there's some things happening daily or regularly, but those are optional, knowing that not everyone can be part of that. And there's notes being shared out, or there's other ways of communicating. Also recognizing that individuals' lived experiences may impact how they're reacting to changes caused by the pandemic. I spoke with a few of my colleagues who are also women of color. I identify as Asian American. My parents are immigrants from India, and I was talking to two of my colleagues, one who identifies as Afro-Latina and another who identifies as Latina. And we were talking about so much of our upbringing was about resilience and really adapting to whatever challenges we faced, and recognizing that that's sort of how we were addressing this pandemic. Like, these changes were happening and we just had to be resilient, and actually just pausing to talk about how our lived experiences might have shaped that. What are some of the strengths from that? But also, was that holding us back from really just being in this moment and recognizing the stresses we were under and pausing to take that in. And so thinking about how that may impact, and that some people may not be willing to share what those lived experiences are. I've been hearing more and more people sharing, for example, if they're immunocompromised, that's not necessarily something that they want to talk about, but this moment is requiring them to do that, and how conscious communication enables us to think about how we can communicate with others to create that space. As well as using inquiry and advocacy. And I'll share a little bit about what that is. Really, inquiry is asking powerful questions and listening and observing. And even though we're not in person with each other, you can still observe by hearing the tone that people have, or if you're on video, just by seeing their expressions. And I think this is a moment really for inquiry. I've been using inquiry with a lot of my colleagues of, what do you need in this moment? And that's from a place of curiosity, not judgment. So recognizing, like, we're not going to be working at the same capacity or productivity, and that's okay. And what do you need to just be yourself? So not about what you need to do your work, but what do you need just to be humane in this moment. And so inquiry, I think, is particularly important, as well as advocacy, recognizing that all of us have a role to play to be advocating. That may be advocating for how resources are being distributed in this moment, or advocating some of the policies that organizations may have to consider, or changes. So just thinking about conscious communication and being aware when you are, when it's appropriate to have inquiry, and when you really should be thinking about advocacy. So I want to go back here and really just pause around conscious communication, and would love to hear from folks either questions or what are things that you have been doing to really be more conscious in communication in this moment. If you have anything you want to share, please go ahead and take yourself off mute. Ella, there's a question. Go ahead. Oh, maybe not.
I have a question.
Yes.
This is Rebecca. I'm from AFCPE, and we're a national organization, but we're based out of Columbus. When you say about communication, you know, to communicate as much as possible, I think one of the things that we're struggling with right now is over communicating, and sort of like everyone's getting so many messages, and how do you get your voice across in the best way? Can you sort of clarify that piece of it?
Yeah, I think you raise a really important point, because as we think about communicating, I think in particular it's communicating with the staff or those most directly impacted, and recognizing, as you said, everyone's getting so many messages right now. I think I've Great, thank you. So I think that you absolutely are right, which is people are getting so many messages right now. And so communicate really is about how you're communicating with your staff, your volunteers, those most impacted by your programs. And some of that may be, we don't know how this is going to impact the work that we have planned. But letting people know, because in these moments of uncertainty, this is really leads to more anxiety. So right now, I think there's a lot of questions about when will people be able to resume being in space with each other, or when can offices reopen? When can events continue to be had? And I think that's the piece of really communicating with your staff and your volunteers and those who are most impacted, of just letting them know we don't actually know, and we're going to keep checking in and letting you know as we get more information. Other questions or things that people have been doing around conscious communication? I'll go to building relationships, and we can also come back to each of these later on. So a second key practice around leading people is building relationships. And this includes valuing cooperation and kindness. I feel like this moment is one that is just really testing our ability to have humanity with each other. Devoting time and resources to building authentic and trusting relationships to accomplish goals. And we really see that relationship element as core for organizations who are really trying to advance racial equity. That so much of that depends on having those relationships, as well as forming partnerships, networks, and alliances across structural boundaries. So going back to what we shared early on, which is if we're actually going to change systems, that means it's not going to be single organizations that are able to do that. So in this moment, some of the things that we think are important, one is just creating spacious meeting agendas and incorporating check-ins to your meetings. I know a lot of organizations have been doing this, but it's a very simple practice. So at the start of each meeting, whether if it's a large group, using chat functions like I did at the beginning, where people can chat in, but even if it's a meeting with 10 people, having a question that everyone's responding to. And that can be something around what are you doing to take care of yourself, or what's most on your mind right now. We even had on our team check-ins around like, how is your family grappling with some of these changes? Just recognizing that so much of the stress that our team is facing is more so tied to those that they're supporting. And also spacious meeting agendas. I think we often feel like when we are remote, when we're on the phone or video, that we can pack in more things, but actually needing more time to be able to talk about things. Considering how you use one-on-one, team, and large group conversations, and really figuring out the mix of those pieces, that this may be a moment to really lean into more one-on-one conversations so that you can invest in those relationships and have that deeper communication. Prioritizing self-care and not productivity. And so really part of that building relationships is just letting people know that you care about them and you want them to be taking care of themselves. And that may mean things aren't getting done when they were supposed to, or that priorities have to shift, and that's actually okay. And part of how you can do that is using collaborative work planning. So really leaning into inclusive approaches to this, which is like, how do you have a team together figuring out work plans and revisiting that regularly? Because as I mentioned, we don't have enough information to know 2 weeks from now whether we'll be able to do something that was planned in the summer. And so kind of using that collaborative work planning to build relationships and to also think about how you're sharing responsibilities. Another piece is really thinking about not just within your organization. I feel like so many individuals have had to focus on the crisis within their organizations, but also recognizing that this is a moment to look at relationships beyond your organization, because this is going to be a moment that systems are going to shift. And how do you come together with your peers to look at how to best navigate that and to influence that? Be curious here for practices that folks have been doing around building relationships that you'd be willing to share.
We are seeing the responses in questions. So if you go ahead and type in your question, then I can share that. We can send the question out. So our question function is fine if you want to type your questions, and we will see them there.
Great. Tajma, are there things that are coming up here that you could share?
Well, we did have some people, one person, Natalie, wants to know if the slides will be shared later. That's the only question I have right now.
Yes, we can do that later. I'll share a couple things around building relationships, and we're hearing just lots of great stories about how organizations are doing this. I just spoke with someone yesterday where they said their organization figured out how to do a virtual karaoke. So just thinking about how they're bringing some fun into the way that they're connecting and building relationships, as well as I have heard some organizations that are saying, like, we're spending a lot of time on video, so let's instead do walking calls, so that we're getting everyone outside and we can have conversations by phone, but still connect in a different way. So definitely, as people have ideas, so please share those here. I think one other piece on this last piece around prioritizing relationships beyond your organization, I know that ProInspire has a number of peer organizations that focus on capacity building around leadership and race equity. And we came together about a week ago. It was an already scheduled gathering and just really focused the conversation on what should our organizations be doing in this moment, both to support each other, but also to be influencing philanthropy and the organizations that we work with, and really decided, like, we need to come together more regularly in this moment. I know I have a board member who has a group of COO peers, and she was saying that they are now meeting weekly because they're realizing it's so important for them to have these relationships and also share lessons in this moment. The next practice is fostering an inclusive climate. And this really includes a culture of mutual support and care so that people feel safe bringing their problems to the group. This also creates an organizational culture where visible and invisible measures of diversity and individual differences are valued and can be leveraged toward the organization's mission. And finally, cultivating a culture of belonging, that really the question should be an inclusive climate, and leaders at all levels play an important role in ensuring that the culture is one where everyone feels like they actually belong there. What we're seeing in this moment is First, just recognizing that workplaces are one of the most important communities we have. So we're in this moment of social distancing, and people are realizing they actually need community. And the community that we have most ready is oftentimes the community that we're spending our work hours with. And so thinking about how do we have a place of emotional safety, and how do we ensure that this community is strong within our workplace? That also may mean being flexible with schedules and expectations. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but really, and being inclusive, it means that recognizing people are going to have different demands on them, and being flexible, and also not necessarily expecting people to share, because there may be invisible demands that they don't want to share. Expanding and establishing new working norms. So really thinking about how do you want to work together in this time? I think the person who raised earlier, like, in some ways we're having lots of communication. So for example, with my organization, every week I'm asking, so what's the cadence of how often we should be gathering as a team? And that first week that we had moved to remote, it was 3 times a week. And then it was 2 times a week. And we're, just revisiting that on a weekly basis. Also around technology use, what are the technologies we want to be using, and how do we ensure there are things that everyone has access to and feels comfortable with? Finally, another piece of fostering inclusive climate, I think, is going to continue to be important, is responding with support and not discrimination or othering. I think we're seeing a rise in racist attacks on Asian Americans, and some of that's being driven by rhetoric coming from the federal government, as well as over time, more and more people are going to be diagnosed with coronavirus. And how do we prevent our organizations from creating an othering of people who experience that, and really actually be a supportive environment? Are there questions or the practices that organizations are adapting here? And I'll go to the 4th practice to highlight today, which is lifting voices. And this is, we used to call this developing people, but recognize that actually developing people assumes such a hierarchical approach. And lifting voices is really the role of leaders. And that means recognizing that people have unique ways of learning and leading and approaching their work. And as a leader, particularly if you have management responsibilities, part of your role is supporting those unique ways, and really not sort of dictating a certain way is the right way, as well as supporting the development of others, and providing delegation, coaching, and ongoing feedback, as well as really thinking about how the organization can support multiple ways of being and working that reflect the community, that approaches that might be really rooted in dominant culture, if they're not reflective of the community, those approaches really need to shift. And so in this moment, what we're seeing is collaboratively creating shared outcomes, frequently revisiting short-term goals because we know these goals are shifting so rapidly. Also enabling decision-making by those closest to the work. So part of lifting voices means that not all decision-making needs to sit at the top of an organization, and supporting leaders at all levels to take on responsibilities in this moment. I was on a call yesterday with a number of people who are part of the ProInspire Leadership Network, who are oftentimes in middle manager responsibilities, and they're really seeing this as a moment where they can be stepping up and taking on more responsibilities in their organization, lifting the voices of the people that they work with, and also ensuring that their voice is heard in some of the challenges that the organization is facing. There are questions or thoughts on lifting voices or inclusive climate? Okay, so a few other things to be thinking about as it relates to how to support your team during times of unprecedented change. And some of these are things I've shared before, but really recognizing that we need community now more than ever, and treating each other with humanity in the workplace is critical, especially in moments of crisis. And so I think this is particularly important for leaders who are looking at What are the policies that need to be put in place, or how do they really create a culture that's supporting people to navigate all these changes? Another piece is recognizing the psychological process people go through in times of change. Oftentimes we work with organizations that are going through a CEO transition or a racial equity change process. We talk about how there's change, which is external, and there's transition, which is internal. And each individual is going to have their own transition to adapt to our new reality. And so leaders really have to think about how to adapt to each individual's transition, as well as your own experience adapting to the new reality. So these changes are happening so rapidly, and making time for that psychological process that individuals are grappling with. The other piece around this change is that we're really in the messy middle of change, which is that we don't actually know what the future is going to look like. And when we're in the messy middle of change, that means there's lots of anxiety. And it's okay to admit you don't have the answers, but just share information and name the anxiety. A key element of supporting people through change is the fact that we're going to go through this really challenging period and we're going to get through it. And so just naming that this is a very stressful time because we don't actually know what it's going to look like, or when things will change, and acknowledging that. Prioritizing self-care and not productivity. I mentioned that earlier, but really modeling that yourself. Talking about what you're doing to take care of yourself, and talking about why mental health is important during times of stress, and then responding with support and not discrimination. And that means taking care of each other in sickness and in health, and really just recognizing that people are going to be facing a lot of different challenges in this moment. So I wanted to give you a chance to just write down, how are you bringing these practices into your leadership? Conscious communication, building relationships, fostering inclusive climate, and lifting voices. And if you have a piece of paper, you can write this down of how are you bringing these into your leadership, and what is one practice that you could strengthen? What's something you can commit to doing? And I'll pull this back up so you can look at that. I'll give everyone a minute to just think about that. And then once you've had a chance to think about that, would be great, one, to hear if you're committing to something. Please feel free to share that, or questions that people have. And I saw some of the things that have come in around what people are doing to take care of themselves, making time for outdoors and exercise. That's so important. We've been talking about on our team at ProInspire, each of us kind of having some projects that we want to do where we live, whether it's reorganizing or decorating or things like that, and sharing those out with each other as a way to kind of bring that into our work. Tasha, are there any other questions that are coming up?
Hi, I'm not seeing any right now. I want to see if Abigail can call through the questions for us. Yes, please. Having a little technical challenges here on my laptop, Monisha, so that's why I'm wanting to see if Abigail navigate through whatever questions are coming through for us.
Well, if there's no questions, I just want to say thank you for joining. Thank you for all you're doing in this moment to really lead and to think about how to be inclusive and advance the impact of your organization at a time that it's so needed.
Unmuted.
Our info's on here, so if there were questions, you can also email us. I'm happy to respond.
Monisha,
Yeah.
stepping in because we do have a question in the questions area, so I'm just going to read it out loud. So long story short, I'm just starting to do pro bono work with a new client who's looking at educational funding equity. How do we get white people to care about sharing funds? Example, PTA, Booster Club.
That's a great question. I think one of the things that we've seen is really more and more white people taking on learning, particularly if they're being encouraged by others to understand racial equity and structural racism and how those connect to the work they care about. I recently had facilitated a board retreat that was focused on race equity, and there were 2 white men on the board, and they shared that they had read White Fragility together before the board retreat to prepare themselves. So I thought that was a just really interesting example, and I think that can be an important thing of like, how are you encouraging people to do their own learning? So going back to the practice of active learning, and not putting that burden on people of color to do the learning, but some of that might be connecting them to other white people who've done a lot of learning, and really supporting them to do that level of understanding so that they can make better decisions around the philanthropy or funding they're doing. I also recommend the Nonprofit Quarterly has done a lot of great articles on this around race equity, racial justice. In fact, there was just one this week by Lori Villarosa from the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, which was about racial justice and the COVID moment. And so even sharing some of those resources can be really powerful.
Great. And there's one more question. How have you seen leaders foster inclusive climates when other leaders are responding from a place of fear? How can expectations be reset?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? We're in this moment of so much fear and a lot of confusion around how this crisis is even being handled. And so I think that particularly people in positional authority, like, have an important role to play to be modeling. And even if you don't have positional authority, the role you have to influence people is so critical. So some of that may be using inquiry and advocacy around communicating, but really talking about why an inclusive climate is so important, why it's even more important now than ever before, is a way to really highlight this, I think, within organizations, even if you see other leaders who are shifting their tone.
Great. I think that's the end of the. Actually, one more. What is your top tip for fostering an inclusive climate remotely?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. I think the top tip for fostering an inclusive climate is really recognizing that people are going to need different things. So the idea of like one size fits all is not the case. And to be inclusive, we have to be much more adaptive. So that might mean doing things multiple times or in different ways, and that people are going to have different needs to be able to show up and do their best work.
Great. And the last question, any resources to share examples of other communities who have been able to do this, fund districts equally?
Yes, and this was around school districts, is that right?
I believe so.
So I think there's some great resources. One is the Government Alliance for Racial Equity, which is a project out of the Haas Center and Race Forward, and they have a tremendous amount of resources focused on government around this. And then I would also look at Leadership for Educational Equity, and Promise 54, both of those organizations focus specifically on equity and education, and I think they would also have some really good resources.
Great.
Great. Well, thank you all for being on. Feel free to email if there's any questions, and I'll hand it back to the Women's Funding Network.
All right. Thank you so much, Monisha. And we will be sending the slides out, and we appreciate you all taking the time to join us today amidst all that you are doing, which I know is a very busy time. So do take care, and we thank you all for joining us.